They might be one of your uncles or your cousins or something like that. Good morning, friends. In this video, I'm going to distinguish the difference between homosexuality and homosexual pedophilia, something that I think is an important contribution to the communal discussion, something that may be able to protect some homosexuals from undue antagonism toward themselves. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. Now let's get started. First of all, before we get started, let me introduce you guys to the two motivations that are guiding me in making this video. The first is that I believe that the word homophobia, which is commonly thrown around in society and probably inaccurately, I think that a lot of people that are called homophobic actually hate gay people as opposed to are scared of them, while I believe another subset are actually scared of them. I think that there are three major causes that I've come across for homophobia in my lifetime, speaking with other men. One is an actual kind of homophobia. People who have some kind of repressed interest in that and feeling that they have to follow communal values and not be homosexual. So they have a kind of fear and they mistreat sometimes homosexuals because of their own fear about what it may say about their own sexuality. And second is a cause of what's not actually homophobia in my opinion, but a kind of hatred toward gay people or a kind of looking down upon them. And this comes from Judaic biblical traditions. I don't want to offend any people that are Christians or Muslims or Jews, but I just wanted to mention that those three religions have inseparably within their sacred texts stories about the harmfulness of homosexuality. In fact, these stories show a God who is very vengeful toward homosexuals, who hates homosexuality. For those of you that haven't come across these stories before, probably because you haven't studied the religious text that much, you'll find these stories in the Old Testament in Christianity, you'll find them in the Quran and Islam. They're stories that regard the prophet Lot, or Lut in Arabic, and the stories of a city named Sodom, the origin of the word sodomy. But there's a third reason I believe that some people are particularly antagonistic toward homosexuals. And I've never heard anyone mention this reason before themselves, but I've thought about it for a long time. Many of my experiences with other people in life indicated to me that the people that were the most hateful toward homosexuals tended to be people that were molested as children. I think that these men, and it happens I've noticed more often with men than women, I think that these men incorrectly associate their molestation at the hands of other men with homosexuality. This mistake leads these men to be fearful of and hateful towards homosexuals, thinking of them as related to the people that abuse them. I learned over time, through my experiences meeting homosexuals as well as reading extensively on this topic, that this is likely untrue. That the homosexuals that these men are meeting in their lifetimes are unlikely to be the kind of people that would molest children. In this video, I'm going to academically cite that. I'm going to ground it in statistics and academic research. And I'm going to show you, if you're one of those men, why you shouldn't necessarily fear all homosexuals because of something that happened to you as a child. But there's a second reason that I'm making this video, and that's to draw attention to pedophiles. Now, by the way, in this video, I'm going to probably say pedophiles once in a while, but I may also call them molesters. And the reason is because the word molester is connected to the verb molesting and molested. And the reason I'm going to use the word molester, molesting, or molested sometimes is because there's a continuum there within a single word, and it connects the victim to the abuser. Whereas when we use the word pedophile, some people will not associate it with the person that may have molested them in childhood, but instead think of it as some kind of like serial killer kind of character that's really far off. Whereas I bet many of you, even the ones that were not molested, have experiences or know in your family of somebody that molested somebody. Maybe not from your family, but somebody, and usually they got away with it. So what we're talking about here are the molesters. Those could be what you could classically call pederasts or pedophiles. And pederasts, by the way, are defined as people who molest slightly older children, and pedophiles are those who molest strict children, very young children. Anyway, I'm going to use that term so it's relatable and we're continuous throughout, but I may call them pedophiles sometime. The reason that I want to draw attention to pedophiles is not actually because of the immense harm that they cause to children, which by the way have lasting impacts on these children's lives, as we'll see in this discussion. And briefly to comment on that, children who are molested are more likely to become sexual victims later in life, massively more likely. They're more likely to have mental illness later in life, massively more likely. They're almost twice as likely to have suicidal attempts later in life. They have miserable lives, and it affects them throughout their lives and scars them, changing also their sense of identity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And moreover, another important facet of this effect on the children is that there's an intergenerational effect. It's not as large as you might think. It's not that the molested always molest others, but there is a small effect. So it's a chain that continues because of the activity of pedophiles, because of the fact that they're free and not in jails. And that is the second reason I'm making this video. It's the fact that so many pedophiles in America are free. They're punished very lightly. How I discovered this myself was that for many years I lived in a place called downtown LA. Downtown LA has some nice buildings and they try to make it a sort of trendy place where there are nightclubs and so on. But downtown LA is also about, where I lived at least, was about 5 blocks away from what's called Skid Row, one of the largest open-air drug markets probably in the world. Because of the fact that the homeless have decided to sell drugs and use drugs in Skid Row, a lot of facilities have been built around Skid Row to essentially assist them. Some of these facilities include housing that a lot of people that recently get released from the jail there, for example, apply for and stay at. Many people actually in downtown LA are supposedly homeless but actually have apartments very close by. And because of this reason, you encounter some interesting people living around that area. Anyway, the reason why I'm telling you all of this is that one night while I was living in my apartment in downtown LA, I was probably bored and researching online. I realized that there were maps in the United States that were publicly accessible for everybody, where you can learn where sexual offenders who have to register as a condition of their release from prisons are shown. Their homes are shown on this map so that you can see where all of these people live. When I found this map in downtown LA, I was flabbergasted. I had no idea that I had been living there for 3 years or so. I had no idea that I was surrounded by pedophiles. Everywhere, within a mile, it was so densely populated. By the way, if you guys are interested in this, go online and search for the pedophile maps of downtown LA. You'll be surprised yourself. And by the way, these people weren't all in that free housing from the government, which is very cheap, called Section 8 or things like that. Some of these people had normal apartments. I could tell from the buildings they were staying at. Anyway, this shocked me. The density of them around me shocked me. But then something else shocked me even more, which is that I spent some time looking at their profiles. Now, by that time, I had already been arrested myself. I spent a year in the LA County Jail. To be honest with you, I was partially innocent of the crime I was accused of. And I basically served 2 years of state time, because in LA County Jail, because of the level of arduousness that it takes to live there, the danger and so on, you get double time for the time you spent there. So I basically served what amounts to about 2 years in prison for something I was partially innocent for. And anyway, even if I wasn't innocent for it, while I was in jail, I met so many people that were completely innocent of their crimes. And moreover, I met some people who weren't innocent but did something so small as, for example, I remember meeting a man who was arguing with another man on the phone. And this guy, I think he was using drugs or something like that at the time. He said as a figure of speech, "I'll kill you," and closed the phone. This other man reported that statement to the police and he got what's called a criminal threat citation. Criminal threat in Los Angeles is punishable by more than a year in prison and can give you a strike, a violent strike. So this guy got both of those things. And there are so many more examples. I mean, for example, I knew many people who had robbed places at gunpoint but never harmed anybody, who received over 2 decades of sentencing. That means they spent, and these are people in their 20s, they're gonna live there till their 40s. Whereas, when I went on this pedophile map, and you can do it yourself, I found so many pedophiles who had been arrested for molestation of children, spent 2 years to 3 years in prison, and got released for good behavior, and then went back into prison. And by the way, some were not released for good behavior. Their original sentence was that. So they go to prison, come back out, re-offend the same crime, go back into prison, come back out, re-offend again, go back into prison. Maybe the third time they spent 4 or 5 years, they're back out there living next to me. These are men who molested children. I was shocked, and this is the kind of stuff you see honestly in the United States, in some of these states that are very liberal with their sentencing. They really punish gun crimes or robberies and stuff like that, but the pedophiles are walking around doing whatever they want. They go in for 2 years and come right back out. 2 years in prison as opposed to LA County Jail is not a very serious punishment for somebody that molested somebody. I'm sure most of you can agree, a man who molests a child, even for the public safety, even on the first offense, should be jailed for a significant amount of time. Enough time to make that person really be cautious next time. And honestly, from what I see from talking to people, a lot of people believe that these people should be put in prison on the first offense for life. And other people think that they should be executed for multiple offenses. So this is the kind of public opinion on the subject, yet somehow the laws in LA allow people to just frequently recommit. I mean, you guys go look at the profiles. I won't bore you with this discussion. Go look at it for yourself and you'll see that pedophilia is not something properly criminally treated in the United States. And by the way, this has nothing to do with me personally. I care about children and I hate this kind of behavior. Even if you want to say somebody has a weird, unusual predatory sexual attraction, even if they're born that way. They still cannot do it. You're harming somebody. What if somebody was born, they're attracted to raping women? You wouldn't say, oh, but he was born like that. You wouldn't say that. He has no right to rape a woman, and he has to be put in jail or prison for a serious amount of time for that. Anyway, friends, I didn't want to go that off topic. I was just trying to point out to you that this subject is a very serious subject for two reasons, really. One reason is that I believe that many men dislike homosexual men because of being molested themselves by men when they were younger, and they think that pedophiles are just homosexual men, which they're not, and we'll see soon. And second, because pedophiles are treated inordinately well in the United States of America and across the world, but in particular in the United States, and we have to do something about this. Now that we're done with introductions, let's get into the subject of discussion. First, let's find out how common is molestation among people in general across the world. Well, first of all, I'll refer to a meta-analysis from 2011. The rate is about 12% of all people are molested in childhood. Now, this 2011 meta-analysis that I'm referring to confirms an earlier meta-analysis, and it used 9.9 million people in it. It is very accurate and very consistent. At least 1 out of 10 people on average is molested in childhood. You know many people that were molested in childhood personally. However, you might not know that they were molested, and this is because of many reasons. Let me give you some evidence of this. From the 2011 meta-analyses, as I said, on almost 10 million people, we see that self-reported incidence of molestation is 30 times higher than what is reported by what's called informants, i.e. parents or police or school people or so on. 30 times higher. So the actual molestation is very infrequently discovered among the community. 30 times higher do people report it themselves than other people discover it. Moreover, if you split the incidence of molestation between the genders, you find that the incidence is only 8% in men, but 18% in women. And most academics have theorized that this is because of several reasons to do with men's willingness to admit the molestation. So this original number of 12% is a downward facing number. It's what people were willing to admit. There's a lot of evidence that men in later age are still unwilling to admit what happened to them in childhood. So these scores, that 12% global incidence, is, if anything, very conservative. In fact, academics think that the difference in genders here has to do with two things. One might be actual difference in frequency, although I don't actually agree with that. And the second is the men's gender-specific refusal to admit what happened to them. And by the way, we'll find out later, one of the reasons may be because men are more likely to be molested by men than women. Whereas in women, this is not the case. And to understand some more about the thinking behind not admitting being molested in childhood, let's look at a 2020 study on Israelis. They found that there were a few consistent reasons that these Israelis did not want to admit what happened to them in childhood. In particular, one was that the molester was often a superior in the family of some kind. A second is that they blamed themselves. A third is that they didn't trust that others would believe them. And a fourth is wanting to minimize what happened. In particular, it might be because these people are often family members and important to them in their lives. And a final is disappointment, either in themselves or the abuser. And there's specific evidence that men underreport this as opposed to women. For example, boys report less sexual abuse than men. This is not found among women. Young women report similar rates as older women, whereas with boys, they're more likely to increase the rate as they get older. On the other hand, women report sexual abuse much earlier after it happens as compared to boys. So there's a few reasons to make us think that that 8% incidence in men is really not correct. It may be much closer to the 18% incidence in women, nearly 1/5 of people. And by the way, the 18% incidence in women is also an underestimation because many of them still have not admitted their incidence, as we'll see when we look at geography, which we should talk about now. If you look at these statistics globally, what you'll find is that in Australia and New Zealand, women are the most willing to admit childhood abuse, and they have the highest rates of incidence of childhood molestation and abuse. Now in Africa, there's unusually high rates of molestation in general, and that's also true for South America. These two places are much higher than Europe, North America, or Asia. And in both of these places, interestingly, the frequency of molestation between genders is almost equal. And it's only almost equal in these places with much higher rates, which makes me think that the gender ratio may be somewhat more equal across the world. In fact, there's almost a consensus among academics that Asians, Europeans, and North Americans particularly underreport their frequency due to societal pressures. Now, what does all this mean? Well, essentially, this molestation, pedophilia situation is globally prevalent, and the figures we have, the average 12%, are really low estimates. Most likely, I believe personally, that the real figures are somewhere around 1/5 of people, and much closer between men and women. Although, as we'll see later, women are much more likely to be molested by someone from the opposite gender than men are. And also, the frequency is, by the way, much higher among criminals. In some of these criminal populations, the rates can go as high as over 50%. And this is something I noticed myself when I was in the LA County Jail. These people in the LA County Jail, for example, really hate pedophiles. I've never seen people that hated pedophiles so much. It's just it's a very particular hatred. In fact, while I was there, 2 pedophiles were beaten to death within 1 week. And the guards intentionally led these pedophiles out into normal areas. So the point of what I'm saying though is I noticed this hatred toward pedophiles, because a lot of criminals, especially very violent criminals, you might think of them as being uncaring or callous, but actually they're usually the most sensitive people. They react to their sensitivity with defense mechanisms. What I noticed getting to know very, very violent people, murderers and so on, very closely, is that some of the most sensitive ones of them were the most violent. So at that time it clicked for me. I realized that maybe a lot of these criminals are criminals because they were sexually abused as children. That could be an actual causal factor. And maybe that's why they hate pedophiles so much. For example, if you guys are wondering why do they also hate rapists, they only hate pedophiles and rapists in prisons around the United States. The rapists is because a lot of them were raised by single mothers. I used to have that very protective feeling for my mother because my mother was a single mother when I was younger. Even though I didn't grow up with her, I had those kind of feelings as well myself, so I relate to it. I think that those are the 2 explanatory factors there. Now, what about disclosure of these molestation events to the police, to the authorities? Well, in the US, less than 1/3 of people who are molested admit to it in their childhoods. That's what we think from the figures we have, which are, again, underestimating this. And using those figures, only 1/5 of these cases of molestation are reported to authorities. Whereas in some parts of Canada, 3/4 of people molested never tell anybody or do it at least 5 years later. And in fact, to make this point more clear, there's a fascinating meta-analysis that tried to discover how often the children who are victims of molestation, who are caught by police, the police know about the subject and interview them. How often do they actually lie to the police and claim it didn't happen? That happens in over 1/3 of the cases. So even when the police discover it and the children are safe, they still don't want to admit it. So molestation is very widespread. I would say it happens in at least 1/5 of people, and people really are reluctant to admit it. And in particular, men are reluctant to admit it. So we all underestimate its incidence. Now, we were just talking about the frequency or incidence of molestation events among the general population. Does this differ? Now, we talked about genders and geography. Does it differ among homosexual people? It certainly does. And this is very insightful and little known. Let's talk about that here. First, let's review a seminal 2001 paper on the subject. In this paper that had over 900 participants, homosexual men and homosexual women were far more likely to have been molested previously than straight men and women. In this study, homosexual men had a 46% incidence of homosexual molestation in their childhood. A huge incidence, not of general molestation, but of homosexual molestation, whereas only 7% of heterosexual men did. On the other hand, homosexual women had a 22% incidence of homosexual molestation, specifically when they were children. That's a very large number, whereas only 1% of heterosexual women did. In 2010, a second study built on this earlier 2001 study. This study studied over 100 homosexuals, men and women, not heterosexuals. But they didn't just study homosexual molestation, they studied molestation in general. They wanted to know how the molestation may impact their later lives and why it has an increased incidence among them. Now, they found similarly high rates. About 41% of the homosexual men were molested as children, whereas 31% of homosexual women were molested as children. Still much higher figures than we see around the world. Now, you might think, well, maybe homosexuals are more willing to be open about their experiences because they've identified already as homosexuals. As we'll see later, even if this is true, it's likely not the main factor that's causing this massively increased incidence, where nearly a half of gay men were molested as children. Now, interestingly, in agreement with an earlier meta-analysis, over half of these men and women who were molested as children in this case did not find the experience to be unpleasurable. which is a little bit confusing for me, but it's been shown in the literature that apparently as children sometimes they don't experience this as terrifying as they would have otherwise. By the way, in either case, whenever the molester is a male, they find it less pleasurable, both men and women. This is probably due to the physical power dynamics of the difference between men and children and women and children. And it's interesting because even we're talking about homosexual men, they found it more pleasurable if they were molested by female molesters. The most shocking part of this 2010 study is that 68% of the gay men and 67% of the gay women said that their molestation impacted their later sexuality. Shockingly, these numbers reduced to 53% and 42% when it was only accounting for heterosexual molestation. So the homosexual molestation was identified by the homosexual adults as having influenced their sexual identity more than the heterosexual molestation, and both of them were identified as being significantly impactful on their sexual identity. Next, a 2011 meta-analysis found that the highest reported rates among homosexual men and homosexual women were around 60% in homosexual men and over 70% of molestation incidents among homosexual women. And by the way, both of these groups actually included bisexuals as well. And a 2014 study on over 200 homosexual and bisexual women found that over 50% of them had been molested as children. And this is even when including bisexuals. And finally, a 2016 study on homosexual men, including over 180 participants, found that they had an incidence of over 50% of molestation in their childhoods. So the conclusions from this section are, we learned earlier about the frequency worldwide. We know that it's a low estimate. But what we can see is that the frequency among the homosexual populations is much higher. Even if they're more willing to be honest, it's still so much higher. And we know that these people, the homosexual people who were molested in childhood, say themselves that that event affected their sexual identity. Specifically in the questionnaire, they use the word impacted. So what we've seen here is that there's a greater incidence of molestation among homosexuals. I'm talking mostly in this video about boys, although the research regards girls when I say so. But among boys, what could explain this increased incidence? Well, there's a couple of ideas you might think. You might think, for example, even though they said that they were not identifying as homosexual when they were younger or didn't know that they were homosexual, maybe you might think, well, maybe there were some behavioral traits that made these boys attract the pedophiles. And by the way, this is not what I think. I'm just trying to clarify these things for you guys. If you're thinking that, I'm going to answer that in a little bit. The second thing that might explain this, and there's only a couple of things, there's also the self-reporting, maybe more willingness, but it wouldn't explain that big of a difference. So the second thing is what? That the event itself impacted the later homosexuality of these people. That would be the only other explanatory factor. And as we can see here, they mention themselves that it impacted it. So it might be some combination of the two factors, or the self-reporting, which is very small, but those factors are that these children somehow were identified as being potential homosexual victims because they acted homosexually, or that the actual incidents impacted their greater incidence of homosexuality later in life. Next, let's talk about the molesters, the pedophiles. And these are actually studies on pedophiles, and they mention them as pedophiles, but these are the people that molest everybody. Everybody who molests a child is a molester and a pedophile by definition. So these are not just the people that get convicted for it, but they might be one of your uncles or your cousins or something like that. Among the populations of pedophiles, what's called pedophilic homosexuality, not normal homosexuality, but within pedophiles, the pedophiles who prey on children of the same gender, those people are, if you compare them to non-pedophiles, if you compare normal people that want to date people of the same gender, the incidence of the latter one is way higher. So for example, a 2007 review found that the incidence of homosexuality among the general population is around 2 to 4%, whereas the incidence of so-called pedophilic homosexuality among the pedophilic population varies between 9 to 40%. It is way overrepresented. Not only that, but what's called heterosexual pedophiles who prey on children of the opposite gender, actually molest about half the number of children as the homosexual pedophiles. The homosexual pedophiles average around 10 or so, and the heterosexual around 5 during their lifetimes. So what did we just learn? We just learned that among the pedophilic people, pedophiles who like people from the same gender, let's just call them gay pedophiles. Gay pedophiles are way larger in proportion to the total pedophile population than homosexuals, normal gay people, are in the society. And not only that, but they're the most prolific and dangerous pedophiles within the pedophile community. The gay pedophiles are way more active than the non-gay pedophile. Now let's break down what we just said so we understand it statistically also. If you were assuming that gay people and gay pedophiles are a same group, gay pedophiles are a subgroup of gay people, then you might say, for example, you can't say that the majority of pedophiles are gay. That's not true. It's overrepresented, but they're not a majority. You also can't say that it's more likely for a pedophile to be gay than not gay in general. You can't say that either. But if you thought that they were the same group, you would have been able to say that you're more likely to find a pedophile in the homosexual community than in the heterosexual community. But this is not true because they're not the same community. They don't have the same mechanisms driving them, it seems. Now, to understand that, we have to cite a paper that studies molestation in the Catholic Church. Through extensive analysis over many years, it's been discovered that there are some commonalities among these pedophiles. The reason that this was researched was that initially the Catholic Church thought that it was homosexuality that was causing this kind of pedophilia because it was mostly being done to little boys by grown men. But they later realized, due to these academic studies in fact, that the clergy who were doing these pedophilic actions didn't appear outwardly gay. In fact, they couldn't be caught very easily for having any kind of homosexual tendencies. They acted, for example, they didn't have gender dysphoria. They acted very masculine, and there was not an easy way to distinguish them from being homosexuals. They were attracted to some kinds of femininity in younger boys. They were not attracted to masculinity. As the boys aged, they were less attracted to these boys. Now, as you guys will remember from a recent video I did on how finger lengths affect your sexuality, there's a U-shaped curve for androgenic signaling and homosexual behavior, such that at very low androgen levels, homosexuals develop usually what's called a receptive role, whereas at higher levels, and this is shown in rodents and in humans, at higher levels, they're more likely to potentially be homosexual but have a non-passive, an active, or I forgot what that paper called it, but insertive, they called it insertive, an insertive role. So the insertive role happens, and the ones with the insertive role, so at higher androgen levels, those people do not experience gender dysphoria and don't identify themselves as being at all feminine. Whereas the ones at the lower androgen levels were more likely to self-identify as having some feminine, not necessarily feminine, but not standard gender behavior. So we learned from that study that even within normal homosexual men that are not at all pedophiles, there's a larger group actually that is associated with some minor amounts of gender dysphoria, and there's a smaller group that tends to prefer the insertive position, not the receptive position, that are outwardly masculine and don't share these kind of gender dysphoric traits with the other homosexual men. So even within the academic studies of homosexuality and its drivers, we can identify two populations, one actually larger than the other. And among the anthropologic and otherwise study of the clergy of the Catholic Church, it's been noted that the majority of the pedophiles, in fact, almost all of them, do not experience any kind of gender dysphoria. They don't have any kind of feminine traits. Your gaydar would not go off. If you are homophobic, you wouldn't notice. You wouldn't notice that you're next to a pedophile. So if you've been mistreating somewhat outwardly, maybe you would consider feminine, or some kind of way that you notice that somebody's gay other than them telling you so. If you've been mistreating these people for how they talk or how they act, these are not the people that are molesting children. And if you were molested, these are not the ones who did it to you. It's another predatory kind of people that are pedophiles, that are homosexual pedophiles. Now, whether these people may be related to a certain subgroup within the homosexual population, we don't know. But there's no reason to necessarily think so. It's a very different thing to be attracted to children. Maybe they could be a subset of the homosexual population, but they don't reflect. In fact, they're the opposite. The other main group of the homosexual population that is getting antagonized by people are people who are outwardly gay in some kind of identifying fashion. And in general, these people are attracted to masculinity and masculine features. And therefore, children are not what attracts them. So these are not the people that should be being hurt and antagonized for what happened to you in your childhood. Anyway, friends, I talked way too much. I didn't expect to get passionate about this subject on video, but as you can tell, I am very passionate about people who prey on the weak in general. Whether they be men who rape women or men who rape children, and especially children. I mean, I'm particularly concerned about the welfare of people who can't protect themselves and are permanently damaged by what happens to them through this victimization. These are true victims. Everybody in society wants to say they're a victim these days. The children are the victim. And people who are actually violently raped, those are women that were raped or men that were raped. Those are victims as well. Sexual crimes, in my opinion, are really, really should be punished more. And so I get a little worked up about it. And also, I have many homosexual friends who are antagonized, especially by certain cultures, for their behavior, when I know a lot of these people from these cultures are scared of them or hate them because they think they associate them with some molestation that happened in their childhoods, where in reality these are the opposite of the men that would have done that to you. These are men who are attracted to masculinity and appear in some way to you feminine. That's how you notice them. You wouldn't notice the other guys. Whereas the pedophiles are people who outwardly appear masculine, and even the so-called homosexual pedophiles are not attracted to masculinity in those children. It's very clearly shown in many anthropological studies. But anyway, let me give you some key takeaways here so that you really did learn something from this discussion, aside from seeing how passionate I am about it. First of all, the rates of molestation around the world are likely underestimated. But even with that underestimation, they happen to at least 1 out of 10 of us. And they differ across nations, in particular in Western nations, in North America and in Europe, as well as in Asia. Men underreport particularly so, but in general the figures are lower than they are in, for example, Africa and South America, where also the gender disparity is less seen. Second, people who identify as homosexuals in adulthood are several times more likely to have been molested as children. You can estimate that it's between 30 to 50% of all adult homosexuals were molested in childhood. And moreover, this increased incidence can't be fully explained by increased self-reporting or by gender non-conformity when they were children that would have attracted these predators to them. It couldn't explain it because it doesn't explain it in the woman, and therefore most likely this event had an impact on their final sexuality, which shows you not that homosexuality is something that is undesirable in later adulthood, but it shows you how much of a deep impact the predatory nature of these people had on these later homosexuals' lives. They changed their lives dramatically with that crime. And finally, a direct message to the many male subscribers that are following my channel. I assume many of you were molested in your childhoods, and some of you may have what are publicly called homophobic, but it's really a hatred, a kind of hatred toward gay people. If you are one of those people, consider the things that I've talked about today, which is that those gay people are much more likely to have went through what you went through yourself. And second of all, those gay people are recognized by you because of their behavior, which is mostly, unless they confide in you, a gender non-conforming behavior. The pedophiles don't do that. Second of all, the people that you are recognizing are attracted to masculinity. The pedophiles are disgusted by masculinity. When the boy grows up older and gets a beard, they lose interest, and it's not because of age. I believe, from what I've read extensively, it's because of the masculinity of the boy. They're not attracted to masculinity. These are not the people who should be targeted for the pain you went through. Instead, you should make a movement to try to get severe laws imposed in your country to treat those real predators, those ones that you can't notice, that are attracted to children and not attracted to masculinity. And those are predators. There are different kinds of people. They're the exact opposite of these people. And remember that you may be instead harming people that were also mistreated and molested like yourself. I'm sorry for being so long-winded. This, when we talk about people that are helpless to protect themselves, and then we talk about people going through pain and later in adulthood, we're talking about really two groups of people that maybe went through the same thing, and one of them is being antagonistic toward the others. I really believe that that's one of the three main reasons that people are what's called homophobic. And I'd love if you guys could spread this message so that there's more understanding. I'll see you again this afternoon.